Thank you so much, Marjorie. And it's such a joy to be here with you all. I had a really enjoyable time last night, and I always have a really good time at Susan B. Anthony List events, and that's not something I can say about a lot of conservative events, but they're so fun. Everybody's so nice. I love how many members of Congress and senators are here. Last night, a member of Congress told me that I had lipstick on my teeth, and she made a friend for life. I just will tell you, like, that's a good woman. So I am a right-of-center person, but the one issue that really is the only issue I really care about is protecting unborn children and their mothers. And for me, I still remember when I found out what abortion was. I'd heard something about it. I asked my parents. I was 9 years old, and I still remember them telling me what abortion was, and I just couldn't believe it was real. I couldn't believe that that was true. And that conversation I had with them at the age of 9 forever shaped my life. And I actually began working even at that young age. I was recently looking through files I'd kept from childhood, and I used to keep an annual checklist of what I had done to help unborn children. And I'm just like so lame, but I was like, wow, I guess I really cared about this from a young age. But because I cared about that topic, I also cared about media coverage of the same thing. I grew up in Colorado. We had two newspapers, the Rocky Mountain News and the Denver Post. Neither one is what you would call conservative. One is definitely what you'd call liberal. And I noticed that they would cover the same event differently, the same topic differently, that two reporters could go to the same event and write something different about what they saw. So from a young age, I noticed that the way the media talk about things really affects what your perception of reality is. And I noticed that in particular with the topic of abortion, that when they talked about the issue, they would always put positive language with the abortion supportive side and negative language with the pro-life side. They wouldn't call it pro-life, it was anti-abortion. And the focus of their stories always seemed to privilege one side over another. And this was like 1980s, 1990s. It was a major problem at that time. And there was this pro-choice journalist named David Shaw who actually wrote something for the Los Angeles Times. He did this big analysis of how the media cover abortion. And he was saying that it is just not journalistically defensible. He was pointing out these same issues, the language that they use, the stories they choose to cover, the tone with which they cover pro-lifers versus people who support abortion. That was 1990, and it was really bad then, and I don't think anybody would argue that it's gotten better. And you hear people talking about media bias, but it's one thing to have talked about it in 1990 when there was a major problem, and entirely another in the year 2020 when it's getting worse. This is not mere bias. We are dealing with people who are corrupt propagandists who are pushing a political agenda. And it's very important, I think, that people be fully conscious of that every step of the way. I had, as I mentioned, I've cared about this issue for a long time, go into journalism, and I would think about how to encourage better behavior among journalists. And there was this story, maybe 2013, about an abortion doctor or abortionist in Philadelphia named Kermit Gosnell. And the day that he was charged with some of the crimes that he had committed, the media actually did cover it a little bit. And I'm being very evasive since we're having breakfast. But the grand jury put out a report called, I think, House of Horrors, talking about all of the horrible things happening at his abortion place. There were so many different issues, from the actual murders he had committed to the unsanitary conditions to the fact that you couldn't get someone out of his clinic on a stretcher if you needed to because the hallways were filled with refuse. He was preserving trophies of some of his victims. The staff had to keep their lunches in the same place that they were keeping remains. I mean, it was just normally something that the media would be all over. They love to cover, unfortunately, I mean, this human condition here. They love to cover serial killers. They love to cover issues of disparity. I mean, one of the issues with this guy was that he gave better treatment to white women than he did black women. He gave better treatment to wealthy women than poor women. He discriminated against immigrants. I mean, these are normally issues that the media would care about. They gave a little bit of coverage that first day, and then they were just silent for years. They said, well, we'll cover it once the trial starts. And then once the trial started, they were nowhere to be found. And this really bothered me. So it was in the years right after the media had made like a huge production about the Susan G. Komen Foundation ceasing funding for Planned Parenthood. They really tried to, and I think succeeded in bullying them back into funding it. They'd made a huge, they'd done so much to help Wendy Davis in Texas. They just made her into a folk hero. They tried to destroy and succeeded in destroying like a Senate candidate in Indiana who had said something not particularly well phrased about abortion. So they love covering little stories like that, but then when they had this big story, they were nowhere to be found. So I started just going and adding up individual reporters' mentions of some of these previous stories, and then asking them why they weren't covering the Kermit Gosnell story. So I'd say, you wrote a total of, by my calculations, 87 stories on these 3 other issues that you thought were favorable to people who are supportive of abortion, but you haven't yet covered this story. Why not? And by pointing out the disparity, and it was literally that dramatic. I'm not exaggerating. 87 stories on these 3 issues that abortion supporters wanted covered, but not a single one on this serial murderer in Philadelphia. And it was just fascinating, some of the responses that I had gotten. In some cases, people actually did admit that they should be covering it. The Washington Post health policy reporter responded to me, thanks, Mollie, I don't cover local crime. So, yeah, that is not actually true that the Washington Post doesn't cover local crime. If there's, God forbid, a school shooting in Connecticut, that's a local crime, but you can see that that's of national interest. If there's a police shooting, in Ferguson, Missouri, that's a local crime, or not, but you cover it, right? But somehow, some local crimes are more worth coverage than others, and I think we can probably detect the pattern of why. It really mortified me to see how corrupt the media were, that it wasn't a mere issue of bias, but that it was so much worse than that. Similarly, when David Daleiden revealed the body parts trafficking and had the undercover investigative journalism to back it up, the way the media attempted to crush that story, one of my favorite ways in which they tried to crush that story is they said, that's edited footage. Do you mean edited like 100% of TV news is edited? Literally 100%. Like anytime you're watching TV news, any part of the package that's video is edited. Like by definition, that's what we do. We say, take 5 seconds here and take 10 seconds here, and you use B-roll here to tell the story. Somehow that's okay for them to do, but it wasn't okay for someone to do if they were revealing major news separately from that. This, it's kind of worth remembering too that David Daleiden, a journalist who's risked a lot personally to tell stories, his house was personally raided by Kamala Harris, the current vice president of the United States, not that she was the one doing it, she ordered it as Attorney General. That story barely came up like didn't come up actually during the last campaign. So we had 4 years of major, intense media freakout over Donald Trump being highly critical of the media. And that supposedly was a threat to journalism. But when the person running for vice president raids the home of a journalist to threaten him because he went after her allies in the abortion movement, nothing to see here, no worries. One might think that as harsh, even if you don't like the harsh words that the former president used against the media, actions that actually limit press freedom would be much worse, but not for our media. And even like little things, I think it was last week or the week before, there was this guy who, I don't know how he ended up in the NFL draft, but he was slated to be a number 1 pick. His name was Micah Parsons, I think. Does anyone know how he turned out in the draft? I don't know. Anyway, his story involves that his mother was going to abort him, and she decided against it. And here, he's had this wonderful life, and he was slated to be like a number 1 NFL draft pick. And someone wrote up a story about him with the headline, "Mom's Biggest Blessing." And then the subhead said that he had been spared from abortion. This is all true. This is literally his life story. And journalists got upset. They said, we cannot believe that in the year 2021, someone would be described as being spared from abortion. Even though, he was. It's like, well, I understand you don't want to think about the reality of abortion, but it does end a human life. And so if someone's life is not ended because the mother decides against doing something she was going to do, by definition, he has been spared from abortion. But it's so deep in their thinking that they can't tolerate even telling the truth about something like this. Again, it is impossible to win. I love the phrasing that you guys are working with: preserve, fight, win. It is impossible to win if every one of you does not realize how serious the opposition is. And the opposition is not in a political party or a particular candidate. The opposition really is our corrupt media. They lie, and they lie. And they are not operating in good faith. You have, a many decades-long track record of seeing that people are not operating in good faith, and it needs to be taken seriously if there's going to be, any chance here. First of all, I loved, in their own ways, each and every one of those speeches last night. I thought Ron DeSantis was great, Lindsey Graham was great, former President Trump was great. Something Ron DeSantis said struck me. He said something like, I don't care if the media like me, I don't really like them either. This is the right attitude. I think for too long, to be honest, people who care about this topic are going to be people who like to treat each other decently. It's part of who we are. We want to be good, and we want to give everyone the benefit of the doubt. That's all fine and good, and it should continue to be that way. But naivete is not appropriate in this moment, and I think people really need to understand that essentially our corrupt media are the political opposition and need to be treated as such. Now, I did want to mention one thing about the preserve, fight, win thing. What was it? Oh, okay. So I'm writing a book right now on the 2020 election. My previous book I wrote with Carrie Severino on the Kavanaugh confirmation, and it was called Justice on Trial. It was very fun to report. And we interviewed a bunch of people with the Susan B. Anthony list when we reported it and wrote it. And one thing I really appreciate about the Susan B. Anthony list, as I've grown in the conservative movement, or I've had more engagement with the conservative movement, to be honest, there are a lot of people who have disappointed me. Either they're weak, or they are hypocrites, or they're just not very effective at what they do. And I do not feel that way about the Susan B. Anthony list. Very strong, very thoughtful about how to engage battles, and they're operating at a very high level, and it's just interesting to see. Even when I was covering the campaigns, the Republican and Democrat campaigns this year, I would be in far-flung states, and I would run into Susan B. Anthony list door knockers. And these people are like 18 years old or 20 years old, and they're just like the most bright and joyful people, and they know the issues, and they were, it was actually this year, and this is not true in previous years, they're the only people I ever saw or met on the ground. This is huge. One of the things Marjorie explained to us was that when things were not going well at the federal level, they decided to really focus on the Senate in 2014, understanding that without the Senate, like if you actually look at judicial victories, people can talk about what made the difference here and there. The real difference, to be totally honest, is whether or not you have a Republican Senate. They focused on electing pro-life people to the Senate, and it has paid huge dividends. You have to be smart about what you have. Like when you're up, when you're down, but you have to be smart. And I think when you look at what the Susan B. Anthony list did there, what they did in 2016, when a lot of people did not have the courage to do what they did there, and how they're continuing forward, it's just nice to see. It's impressive. I just want to say, it's rare. I like to see it when I see it, and so I just wanted to make that note. Okay, that's all I have to say, and if you guys have any questions, I would be more than happy to take some here for a few minutes. Okay. Okay, so the question is, if it's that bad, what do we do? And I'm thinking here, you look at the history of, so most people who complain about media bias are in marginalized groups, whether that's like minority voters or religious minorities or the Republican Party or conservatives. You actually hear Republican Party presidents complaining about media bias going back to Eisenhower. That's literally the first president to start talking about the problem with media. By the time of President George H.W. Bush, he has his most popular bumper sticker for his re-election was, "Annoy the media, re-elect Bush." It was like the one applause line at his campaign rallies and whatnot. And a lot of people will say they think the media were responsible for his loss. Okay, at what point do you move from complaining about bias to actually dealing with them like an enemy? I have noticed that some people in Congress have awakened to this and some people haven't. So the way I think of it is, if you're, like, let's say you're a politician and you're running for office and your opponent in the other party says, "I would like you to sit down and answer a few questions." Would you say, like outside of a debate context, just says like, "I'd like to ask you these questions and then I'm gonna write up a story about what you say." Would you ever agree to that? No. You would understand they were there to trap you, make you look bad, use what you said against you, and you would behave accordingly. Well, to be totally honest, the media are far, far, far more effective political opponents than any Democrat that is out there. So treat them like that. Like, it could mean something like, okay, this is totally off topic, but I was really super impressed with something I saw in the Washington Post last week, not by the Post, but that they included this. They ran a story that they later had to retract about Russian targeting of Rudy Giuliani and Ron Johnson, Senator Ron Johnson from Wisconsin. The quote from Senator Ron Johnson was amazing. So the story was about how the FBI took so seriously something that they were briefing Giuliani and Johnson, giving them a defensive briefing to warn them that talking about Biden family corruption is Russian disinformation, or something to that effect. Ron Johnson's statement was like, "Yeah, someone did come and talk to me, and I immediately figured out that it was not on the up and up. I asked them for literally any details, any basis for what they're saying, anything to give me a reason to believe them, and they didn't do it. So I assumed that what they were doing was talking to me so that someday they could leak it to the Washington Post to use against me, and that's exactly what they did. And I was like, thank you. Like, if you're gonna say something worthwhile. Call them out on what they are. Call out everything. Don't be fearful. Or, I think Ron DeSantis does an excellent job of, when the media come after him, and they've clearly decided that he is their number one target for 2024, I think that's obvious, he leans into it and engages what they're doing. So he knew that 60 Minutes was going to write a total ridiculous hit on him. So he leveraged the forces that he had. He, if you know what they're doing, and you can know what they're doing because they ask you questions along a certain line, go ahead and get the questions out. Let people know that there's about to be a hit piece. Let people know how unfair it is, and just speak clearly about it. Just use the truth as your guide. But more than anything, don't treat them, don't call them mainstream media. They're not mainstream, they're not media. So don't call them that. They are corrupt propagandists. So, and when you call them mainstream media, it gives them a legitimacy that they no longer have. I mean, this is objectively speaking. Even polls, which I don't really put a lot of faith in polls, but even polls show that there's almost no trust in these corrupt outlets. Almost none. That's true across the political board. So why act like they have integrity? Why act like they are decent? You don't need to do that anymore. It's not 1980, So I just think mostly it's about just posture, but being smart, using the truth, all those things. Andy.
For writing, what should we call them if not the mainstream media?
Yeah, that is a question. What should you call them? I mean, more than anything, I say, don't call them mainstream. Their ideas are far, far to the left. I was doing this TV show called Media Buzz, where we were talking about how the media actually had gotten a little tough toward Biden, supposedly, because they were pressuring him to expand, open the borders even more. I'm like, that's not being tough, that's just being lefty. The only direction they go is okay, Biden has given us everything we want for our progressive agenda, but he hasn't given us this, so we're gonna push him. That's not mainstream. That's like a issue that is 80-20 the other way. So they are so far to the left. So mostly I care about the mainstream thing, but I don't even like calling them media because that assumes still too much. So I think, you heard Ron DeSantis last night call them corporate media, which I think is an okay thing. You can call them Democrat media, because that's just, to be honest, what they are. And I'm they've broken me so much, and I'm so frustrated that I just call them corrupt propagandists. But mostly I just think, identifying them and targeting them is part of the battle. So, yes. Oh, what to read? Okay, so I get that question a lot, actually, about what to read. I think, the question is, what would be a good place to read? What would be a good thing to do? I think you just more need to be a smart consumer of news. There was this, that Michael Crichton, who wrote Jurassic Park. He also wrote this really good essay on media skepticism and about how the media he wrote this in the 90s, about how the media were constantly making predictions rather than reporting news, and the predictions were wrong. And he came up with something called the Gell-Mann amnesia effect. And the Gell-Mann amnesia effect was named for this physicist his last name was Gell-Mann. And he said that he will read something in his area of expertise in the newspaper, and it'll be wrong. The assumptions are all wrong. It mistakes cause and effect. The experts they talk to aren't actually good experts. And he'll be like, this is a total joke. Then he turns the page and he's like, oh, is that what's happening in Palestine today? So he knows in his own area not to trust it, but then he would trust them the next thing. I think we maybe have gone past that to the point that nobody's or, according to these polls, again, people just aren't trusting the media, period, and that's probably pretty good. So read everything with skepticism. But the places, okay, so the only paper I subscribe to is the Wall Street Journal. Not perfect, certainly not perfect, sometimes frustratingly so, but better than everybody else, I still think. I like to go to Real Clear Politics, which my husband does work for, I have to admit. They put up stuff from the left, the right, and other perspectives, and so you kind of can see what different people are saying across, and they put a lot of news up. And then I am editor at The Federalist, so I would, of course, like to give a huge shout out to The Federalist. We cover all sorts of issues, politics, policy, culture, and get a lot of news out each day. But mostly, I think you find a good reporter and you stick with that reporter, or you find a good outlet and stick with them. Yes, sir. Oh, and this is our last question.
How do you see the media helping to chill the actions of the Supreme Court, the decisions they're making on case selection?
Yes, so the question is about how the role the media play in affecting the Supreme Court, either in their actual decisions or in what they choose. So this is an issue, and it's been an issue for a long time. I can't remember who called it the greenhouse effect, named after Linda Greenhouse, this crazy, crazy pro-abortion far-left person who was the Supreme Court reporter at the New York Times. She now writes opinion pieces, and there's no distinction between the news and the opinion pieces. She kind of came to fame. I think was she one of the people who had been actually marching with pro-abortion activists and gotten a little bit of trouble, and she pushed back on that. She's a piece of work. But she's, unfortunately, human beings what they are. She's been very influential on the court. People did try to receive her approval. I think one of the things that the Trump administration did that was really smart, and of course, we won't really know how it plays out for probably another 10 years, is they actually screened judges for courage. So understanding that this was an issue that they were dealing with previous Republican nominees, they actually looked for people who could withstand intense media pressure, basically looking who's someone like a Clarence Thomas who can get everything thrown at them and not back down. And we write about it in our book, about the different ways that they did that and how they saw that in different nominees, either for the Supreme Court or for these federal judgeships. The case selection is really an issue because of, I think, Roberts. He thinks that he's preserving the integrity of the court while accidentally, I assume it's not intentional, he's accidentally doing a lot to hurt the integrity of the court by not taking cases that should be heard, trying to avoid political fights. And sometimes you just need to have a political fight. I'm writing now on the 2020 election, and I do genuinely believe that the court's messed up by not just taking some cases, regardless of how those would have turned out. People tend to respect judicial decisions in a way that they don't respect, corrupt county commissioners or something like that. And so it would have been helpful to the whole country. And in some cases, they really just made the wrong decision on not taking some cases. But complicated issue, but media, of course, play a huge role. Good news is some Republicans or some conservatives have started to figure out what to do about that and are trying to screen for that. Anyway, thank you all very much. It's been wonderful to be here with you.